Hello, welcome to Creative Connections. I'm Gary Blanchard, and my guest today is one of my favorite artists, Gary Lippincott. Gary, welcome.
Thank you, Gary. This sounds funny, Gary.
Yes, the Gary and Gary show.
Yeah, right.
Okay, so I wanted to start out just by asking, I was looking at your biography, and I saw that you were born in Woodstown, New Jersey, living here in Petersham, but you went to school at the Maryland Institute College of Art in my hometown of Baltimore. So how did you get to Baltimore?
Well, it's kind of a funny thing. I applied to, when I was a senior in high school, I applied to various art schools, many of which, because our art program at Woodstown High School was not that elaborate and not that sophisticated, the portfolio end of things was pretty poor when I went to show at various art schools.
Okay.
And so I got rejected from every art school that I applied to. And it was summer was coming, and there I was going to graduate, and I really didn't even have a place to go yet, so I had resigned myself to probably mowing lawns for the rest of my life. And my guidance counselor at Woodstown High School said, well, you ought to apply at least one more time. How about the Maryland Institute College of Art? Well, I didn't know anything about Baltimore or the Maryland Institute or anything, but I said, well, what the heck? I mean, I've been turned down by everybody else, so let's take it as a sign to try to apply. And within a week, I was accepted and had my portfolio accepted and all, and moved to Baltimore back in '71 for 4 years to get my BFA in painting.
All right.
Yeah.
And how much time did you spend at the Mount Royal Tavern?
Well, you know, I was sort of underage at the time. I mean, I spent some time there, but Maryland's drinking age at that time was 21, and I moved down there at 17. So,
so
you know, the funny thing was New Jersey had switched their drinking age so that I could come home and legally drink, but every time I went to school, I was sort of illegal. Of course, being in the city, nobody really pays attention to that stuff anyhow. Mount Royal Tavern, wow.
Yeah. So I was curious, for one thing on your website, there was a line I loved. Gary has been riding to work on the back of a dragon for many years. Yeah. Is that as much fun as it sounds?
It's probably more fun than it sounds. I do consider myself extremely lucky to have been able to do what I do. Well, I've been doing this professionally since 1984. Not all of it has been on the back of a dragon, but slowly it evolved to where I got more and more jobs that sort of fit my the genre that I excelled at, which was the fantasy, the fairies, the dragons, the wizards, and things like that. So, you know, even though I was pigeonholed in a way, that's exactly what I was hoping would happen in the first place.
Right.
So, yeah.
Right. So your artwork, from the first time I saw it, which was before I got to meet you, your artwork just really grabbed me. Why don't you show us some of the work that you've done so that the people who may not be familiar with your work.
A lot of what I brought, Gary, is things that have been published, and I guess the thrust of the things that I brought that aren't so nationally published, so to speak, are examples of artwork that have been used for more than one purpose. And actually, that's how somebody that's been around as long as I makes still a living at doing what I do, because anything that I've done in the past, I own the copyrights to. So if it gets turned into a deck of tarot cards, I own the copyright to it, and I get paid for that. And the funny thing about this is I swore I was never going to do any big projects ever again, and I wound up doing 79 paintings for a tarot deck, but that's another story. Some of the things that I still make money off of art that I've done in the past and that I'm doing now without being affiliated with the publishing industry, because I'll sort of preface this by saying I don't, even though I've worked for almost every major publisher in the United States, I don't look for that kind of work anymore. There's too much competition. There's too much deadlines that can't be met, because my artwork, I'm still doing it with that little stick with hairs on the end of it
Okay.
instead of a computer. So that kind of thing sort of knocked me out of a lot of work that a lot of people go after. I'm lucky enough that my work's been around long enough that I'm sort of, I see myself almost as a antique dealer to a certain degree, that people that want art that is produced in the traditional method and like the type of art that I do, they're still buying that, in spite of the fact that the market is flooded with computer-generated art and a lot of real fast stuff that's being quickly done, and all. There are people that still appreciate the type of art that I do, and thank God, because but also turning it into, now this is kind of a funny thing, I mean this is really low end, but even using my artwork, I have a person down in New Jersey that buys the image to turn it into metal signs that eventually wind up probably in some bar or...
You know, and it's interesting because that has the look of something that was around from the 1800s.
Oh yeah. Well, my art does, the look of my art does gravitate towards what we call the golden age of illustrators, and it is late 1800s. You know, Arthur Rackham, Edmund Dulac, and those guys.
Right.
So that they were the ones that always attracted my attention, and then eventually the artists that did the Fairies book back in the 70s, Brian Froud and Alan Lee. Alan Lee, who was one of the concept artists for the Lord of the Rings movies, his work attracted my attention. And up until that time, I was doing these huge oil paintings, because that's in art school. I was a painting major. I wasn't really, and I never took a watercolor course or never knew how to use watercolor. In fact, it was one of these things, you stayed away from it if you didn't know how to use it, because it's one of those mediums that you really, but I fell in love with Alan Lee's work in particular, and started looking at, I was lucky enough to see some of his original work, and started looking at that and sort of teaching myself how to use watercolor in sort of the same manner. And he was doing work that sort of resembled the Golden Age illustrators too. So it all kind of, you know, you sort of fashion yourself after somebody else. You hope that your look is going to be unique, without, you know, that it isn't going to look like somebody else's work, but the fact that somebody else's work influenced you, there's going to be a bit of them in just about everything you do anyhow.
Right.
Another way that I still am able to make money off of existing art is turning it into prints, and these are clay prints, limited edition usually. And this particular one, although you probably can't see it because it's got that plastic over top of it, but
that's certain glare on. Let me see if I can hold it up over here and get some of the glare
that
off.
actually is my daughter about 10 years ago.
Okay.
Or actually maybe a little longer than that. But she complained because my son, I have a daughter and a son, she complained that she never showed up in any of the books that I used to illustrate because I got pigeonholed as the guy that does the boys, you know, the guys. And so when she was 16, I did this portrait of her. It's called Elfin Asia. Her name's Asia. And it actually, the original art wound up becoming much more noticed by the fantasy, science fiction fantasy community, because it became a piece that showed up at the Society of Illustrators as the best of a certain fantasy publication. So she actually got more notoriety being Elfin Asia than my son did. My son, who wound up in such books as The Prince and the Pauper. Of course, the story is they looked exactly alike, so I could use my son for the Prince and the Pauper, and
there you go.
It was very economical in that fashion.
Saves on model fees, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. And in his case back then, it was I had to pay him. Now, all the rest of the kids in the neighborhood would have done it for free, willingly, but my son, being the fact that his father had been doing this for a while, it was no big deal for him to be a model, so I had to pay him in Nintendo games or something like that, you know.
Okay.
But, yeah. Some of the other ways I can still make money off of his existing work is another Giclée print, which happens to be also the artwork that was used for a book that I did. It was a Kickstarter project that my daughter insisted that I get into, and it's like the last 35 years of my career, just not all, but almost all of the artwork I've done in the fantasy genre for the last 35 years.
Okay.
And that went very well for me. I did one more piece that also made it into the Society of Illustrators. Is called The Sorceress, and it's a limited edition Giclée print of a old sorceress woman standing outside her cavern with.
And I'm assuming your daughter did not pose for that.
She did not do that. No. I brought one original piece just to show you the size that I might work. This was for a book I did recently for a private author, and it's on watercolor paper. This, of course, gets reduced down in size once it gets made into a book. In fact, that's the book itself, and I won't even bother looking up the page, but it just shows you how they have to reduce it.
So let me ask you, is it more difficult to kind of paint to order than to create your own characters and images?
It's more difficult to paint to order only if you don't like the subject matter.
And I won't ask which specific ones.
Luckily for me, I have managed to, and I'm a bit of a brat in this whole thing, in the fact that I have been able to pick and choose what I wanted to illustrate, and because in the first place I was sort of noted as somebody that would do the sort of fairy tale-ish looking art. There wasn't a lot of jobs coming my way to do skyscrapers and trains and stuff like that.
Right.
So anything that had more of an organic look to it or had a more fantastical look to it, I would get asked to do more of that stuff. And as time goes on, I get even more bratty in the fact that I only choose stuff that I know I'm going to have nothing but fun doing. You know, this last book now. I don't deal with publishers, major publishers per se, but a lot of people are now self-publishing. So what I'm doing now is getting commissioned by people that find me on the internet, and they say, oh, this is the look we want for my story, and they will contact me, and I will, and it's so nice because I can pretty much tell them, in the case of this Christmas book, I was the designer. I was the person that told them what the expense was going to be. I was the person that told them when the deadlines were going to happen and things like that. So I was in complete control as far as all those things that used to bother me about dealing with the publishers. And the mere fact that they came to me meant that they wanted my artwork as opposed to forcing me to do something that I would, and I'd done a lot of art that I was never crazy about, subject matter-wise, crazy about doing, and I think it showed in the end product too.
Yeah. So how did you get into illustrating for publishers?
Well, it's funny. It was back in the 1980s, there was this wave of a need for artists that could paint at least not total photorealism, but realistically, so people could recognize what it was, you know, because they were revamping textbooks and encyclopedias. Obviously, they had no idea that Google was right around the corner, or that the internet was going to just swallow this whole business up. But there was enough of a need for artists to do all these illustrations, and I used to sit there in my studio and do these, and they wanted them almost the size that they were going to be reproduced in the book, because back then there was no scanners either, so they would gang all this artwork together and take one photograph of like 50 pieces on the board, you know. Oh, wow. So they wanted them all pretty small. So I had gone from art school painting these huge oil paintings, these canvases that were humongous, down to painting these little postage-size illustrations for encyclopedias and textbooks, and it was constant. It was, I mean, I probably made more money then than I ever will, because it was so much of that work, and that evolved. People started seeing the work, and it slowly, the person that was repping me also had publishers interested in picture books, so it kind of evolved out of the fact that I was working for this encyclopedia textbook thing, and I started getting picture book work. And one of the first books I did was a Grimm's fairy tale, The Fisherman and His Wife, and then slowly that evolved into getting more and more picture books. And you know, and one of them I can't say was attributed to that. One of them was attributed to the fact that I became friends with more and more people, more creatives, more people in the industry. One of which was Jane Yolen, who's a very well-known author and does a lot of picture books, does a lot of everything, poetry, adult novels and things. But I did this book called Come to the Fairies Ball in collaboration with her. So there's all kinds of ways that the career kept on a steady path. Yeah.
Okay, so how did you get into the whole fantasy genre? I know
that is probably the most asked question, other than how much do you make. All the 5-year-old kids want to know how much you make, but most people want to know what led you to that. You know, I grew up on a dairy farm in southern New Jersey, Woodstown, New Jersey, and I must have horrified my parents, because instead of asking for sporting goods or trucks when I was a little kid, I wanted puppets, I wanted marionettes, I wanted ventriloquist dummies. Eventually, when I was making some money mowing lawns and all, I sent it all to a place down in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, called the House of a Thousand Mysteries, and it was a place that sold magic tricks. So I think I was like, I was born this way, you know. Okay. I'd always had this penchant for the bizarre, and you know, I used to go out into the fields on this dairy farm looking for fairies with a butterfly net, you know, thinking I was going to catch them that way, you know. So it's always been there, and it wasn't until I started illustrating books and things that I was actually able to, you know, wanting to be a wizard all my life, where this is as close as I could could get to being a wizard was by sort of making up these little worlds, these little realms that a wizard
Right.
can exist in.
Yeah, we're of basically the same generation, probably
Yeah.
a year or so apart. And
Oh,
I
you're
know,
much older than I am.
Well, probably, yeah.
No,
But I know that it was almost a requirement to read Lord of the Rings at one point in the 60s.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if that was part of what influenced you, or...
You know, Gary, I didn't read The Lord of the Rings till about maybe 15, maybe 20 years ago. It wasn't. That's the other thing, is I attend a lot of science fiction fantasy conventions all over the country, sometimes as a guest artist, sometimes as just an artist that's going to meet people and all. And people come up and they think, because I'm doing this kind of artwork, that I must have read every classic fantasy thing in the world. Well, I haven't. And the fact of the matter is, I almost admit to being fantasy illiterate. I have read Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit and all that, but some of the, you know, there's so much out there to read. And I've always been someone that that same type of time that people take to sit down and read a book. I've got a sketch pad in my lap, and it's that same kind of time. So instead of being this well-read guy, I'm sitting there doing my sketches and working on my fantasies, you know.
Right. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I don't have that, you know, I don't have that background in all the classic fantasy literature.
All right. Yeah.
I love the movies. That quickens it a little bit,
Well,
you know.
it's funny because I couldn't get into the movies.
Yeah.
But I did reread the books.
Yeah, right.
So I wanted to ask you how you got involved with Workshop 13.
Strictly because of Rock Goudreau, who was the one responsible for starting the whole thing. He and a friend, Chris DiMarzio, bought that church and renovated it big time. And Rock is still a member of Western Massachusetts Illustrators Guild, which is a 30-plus group of people out in the Pioneer Valley, filled with creatives, whether it's writers or illustrators, artists, and photographers and things like that. So I had met him a few times during the time that I was also a part of that group. But he asked me if I would get involved, and I said yeah. It sounded like something that I might be interested in. And I'm glad I did, because we are wholeheartedly trying to put something together that Ware is very lax of, and that's a place where people can get a taste of some culture, some art, some fun, some music, and it continues to grow. It's a non-profit organization. We're putting on concerts. We got a concert September 7th that people are, I mean, we're going to sell it out, I'm sure. And we're opening up a gallery and a ceramic studio right down the street from here, and it's continuing to evolve in a very positive way. I never understood why Ware had such a hard time. You know, you drive through it. You know, Route 9 goes all the way from Boston to the other end of the state. 32 comes from Keene and goes all the way down into Connecticut, and you think, wow, geographically, this place should have it. It's not that far from the schools of the Pioneer Valley. It's not that far from Worcester, and yet it always, you know, it didn't. It had a disease or something, you know. So we're trying to cure it in that way.
Yeah. And I think that, you know, there is such a thirst for creativity and arts in the area.
Yeah.
And it's wonderful that there's a place for that.
Yeah.
So we're running a little short on time. I just wanted to ask you, is there a question that you wish I would have asked?
What about tomorrow? I don't know. I guess if you had asked the question, what do I see as far as future projects, and I'll go. I think more of the same is in my book of things to do. I don't see a lot of change. I'm very, like I say, grateful that I get to wake up in the morning and jump on that dragon and ride it to the studio, you know. And I just, I don't know how long that's going to last. I guess it's going to be up to probably my eyesight, which still seems to be okay, and my ability to hold a brush so I can do all the little tiny details that I have become known for. So I would say that the future is hopefully as good as the past has been.
Well, that's great. I look forward to seeing a whole lot more of your work because, as I say, I've really enjoyed the work that I've seen by you, and it's wonderful to get to know you as a person.
Likewise, Gary.
So I want to thank you for joining us here at Creative Connections, and we will be seeing you again real soon.
Thank you.
Take care.
You too.